Okay, so good evening and welcome to our virtual Wayland Library event. Tonight we are excited to have Wayland's own Tonya Largy here to talk to us about archaeological evidence of Native American culture in our area. Tonya is an archaeological consultant specializing in the analysis of plant and animal remains from archaeological sites. She is associated with the Zooarchaeology Laboratory of the Peabody Museum at Harvard. She's been active in local archaeology since the late 1970s and has been involved in numerous excavations in the Sudbury Assabet Concord River basin, the broader Northeast, and as far away as Pakistan. Ms. Largy is a member of the Wayland Historical Commission and coordinator of the Wayland Archaeology Group. She's also past president of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. I want to thank Tonya so much for presenting tonight. And I just have a couple of Zoom housekeeping notes. First, we are recording the session, so it will be available on Waycam on their channel and also on their YouTube page. So you'll be able to share with your friends, or if you missed part of it, come back and see it. And I think I have it set up so that you're seeing what I'm seeing, but if not, I recommend you switch your view to side by side so that you're seeing the presenter, Tonya's face, as well as her slides. Oh, and the last thing was, feel free to add your questions using the Q&A feature at any time. Try to use Q&A, not chat. And I'll be sure we get to them during the Q&A portion of Tonya's presentation. So now that we've got that all out of the way, we are ready to get started, and I'll hand it over to Tonya.
Okay, thank you very much, Courtney. I'd like to thank all of the people in the audience whom I can't see for coming to hear this talk tonight. I really appreciate that. Well, Native Americans have lived in southern New England for 10,000 years, and tonight I will discuss how archaeologists learn about ancient peoples from several lines of evidence, including stone tools, ceramics, and the remains of animals and plants found during excavations, and how dates are obtained from these materials. I will also discuss several archaeological projects carried out in Metrowest communities. And what I'd like to do is to give you a little bit of background information about the two subspecialties in archaeology. Slide 2. Archaeology projects often are either pre-colonial, meaning Native American, or colonial historical, but sometimes there are elements of both in a particular site. Here's an example of a major archaeology project which includes both. The Boston Big Dig. Now I'm sure a number of you have heard about that. This booklet was published in 2001 by Secretary of State Galvin. The Massachusetts Historical Commission, which includes the State Archaeologist's Office, operates out of Secretary Galvin's office. Thousands of artifacts were found, ranging from Native American sites to a 17th century widow's home to a 19th century glass factory in South Boston, and numerous other sites. The Massachusetts Historical Commission, which we'll call MHC for short, usually sponsors an annual event in October called Massachusetts Archaeology Month. This says 2019 calendars of events. That's last year.
Go back 6 inches.
6 inches?
No, push your chair back. You're being cropped. Okay.
Okay. My husband is concerned about me and the screen. The Massachusetts Historical Commission, or MHC for short, usually sponsors an annual event in October called Massachusetts Archaeology Month. 6 Metrowest communities listed here on the slide participated in 2019. In a normal year, the Archaeology Month calendar of events is listed on the MHC website. This is the first year since 1992 that Archaeology Month is not being held officially in the Commonwealth. This is the only Archaeology a Month event that will happen in Wayland this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Usually what we do in the Historical Commission is we sponsor a talk. Especially, I would like to express my thanks to the library for sponsoring my talk, and especially to Courtney Michael for her support, since this is my first Zoom presentation. So I ask everyone to bear with me. Next slide. Definition of terms. I think this is an important thing to do when one is giving a lecture that involves Native Americans, American Indians, or Indians, whatever term you're used to hearing about. What's the proper name to use in speaking about Native Americans in North America's indigenous people? American Indian is favored over Native American by some Native groups. Indian has been the term used for several centuries. An explanation about how this name came about has been circulating from some time now as follows, and I quote, "The word Indian comes from Columbus's description of the people he found here. He was an Italian and did not speak or write very good Spanish. So in his written accounts, he called the Indians una gente indios, which means a people in God. This morphed into Indios and then Indian. However, further research showed that this exact information is not mentioned anywhere in the letter that Christopher Columbus sent following his voyage. When people came from the Indian subcontinent, that term became confusing, and now Indians, meaning American Indians, has become secondary in usage. Several years ago, I attended a lecture at Harvard University by Kevin Gover, the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. He is a member of the Pawnee tribe of Oklahoma. He told us that people prefer to be called by their tribal name. For example, Wampanoag, Massachusetts, Apache, Navajo, Pawnee, etc. If you do not know his or her tribe, they don't mind being called Indian. The Narragansetts in Rhode Island officially call themselves the Narragansett Indian tribe. So that's part of their identification. The Athabasca Glacier in the Columbia ice fields in Canadian Rockies, Jasper National Park, Canada. That's what we're looking at. My family visited this glacier in 2011. A similar ice sheet called the Laurentide Ice Sheet entirely covered New England, wiping out anything that was here before. There is evidence for animals such as fossil dinosaur prints in western Massachusetts and fossil plants, but not people. Depending on which paper you read, the ice sheet retreated by 20,000 or so years ago. Glacial Lake Albany in New York and Glacial Lake Hitchcock are the dark red features running north and south on the map. You can see where New York and Vermont and New Hampshire are down into Massachusetts. So they were formed as the ice melted and retreated. As the glaciers melted, glacial lakes Sudbury and Concord covered much of our area. This marked our present geological period, which is called the Holocene. So we are definitely now in the Holocene period. The eastern shoreline extended out to Georges Bank, and the red arrow points to where the coastline was. By Paleo-Indian times, 13,000 to 12,000 BP, Archaeologists always use BP because that stands for before the present. Plants moved in from the south, followed by animals, followed by Paleo-Indians. The red arrow makes the extent of Georges Bank visible, as I said. Early peoples could walk to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, which is hard to believe today. Mastodon remains and stone tools have been brought up in fishermen's nets. The native people, the Narragansetts especially, have had a long-standing oral tradition that people had lived out there, so they are especially interested in what's turning up. The Paleo-Indians traveled in family bands, 10 to 15 people, usually related. The Vail Site in Maine is one of the oldest sites in New England, going back to 12,900 BP, or years ago. And the Vail Site is the longer red arrow that is on the top in Maine. In Ipswich, Massachusetts is another old and also the largest Paleo-Indian site in New England. That's the small red arrow. It also dates to 12,900 years ago, or BP. These are two examples of fluted points. Now, the Paleo-Indians made and used exotic material to make stone tools like these fluted points, which are diagnostic of the period, and tell archaeologists that early people lived and hunted in a particular area. Archaeologists call these types of tools points because they were used not only for projectiles as stone tips of spears. A recent microscopic use-wear studies have shown that they were also used as knives for cutting and scraping plant and animal materials. One possible fluted point fragment was found in Weyland many years ago, 60 plus years ago, according to what I have heard. Also, one was found in Concord. Now here is a map of the rivers in Massachusetts, and I wish I could use my pointer to show. Courtney's helping me out. There's the Sudbury River, joined to the Assabet River, and on up to the Concord. They become the Concord. There's the Charles River also south of that. So rivers were really, really important, and they were central to pre-colonial populations, and also very important to the colonists when they arrived. Rivers presented resources for hunters and gatherers, including transportation by canoe and footpaths. They walked along the rivers. Rivers were defensible locations because they could see who was coming. It offered availability of fish and game and turtles, which were a common food source, believe it or not. Wetland plants were available for baskets and mats, for medicine, and for food. The English settlers also valued the same resources. Archaeologists look for these remains in both pre-colonial and historical sites to understand subsistence, what people were eating and living on, and the seasonality of occupations. Those are two things that I am concerned with when I'm doing an archaeobotanical study of a site. Early time periods are recognized by archaeologists working in southern New England. Paleo, early, middle, and late archaic, and terminal archaic. Archaeologists love to divide periods into early, middle, and late. Next slide. More recent time periods include early woodland, middle woodland, and late woodland, and the contact period. Next slide. Public planning and environmental review guidelines, which this book represents, for archaeology and historic preservation were issued by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. And here are the procedures to identify archaeological sites in previously disturbed lands that would be impacted by development. So the types of state and federal projects that would be included are highway expansions, bridges, railroads, cell towers, and reservoirs. The Massachusetts legislation, established in 1963, established the Massachusetts Historical Commission and the Office of the State Archaeologist. They recognize that preservation of historic and archaeological resources is one of the public goals and responsibilities of the Commonwealth, and that includes local projects on land owned by towns and cities. Next slide. So I'm going to give you some examples of local projects. The Route 20 bridge replacement in Weyland took place in 2009. I know there's more recent work on Route 27, but this is Route 20 we're talking about. Massachusetts DOT contracted with UMass Amherst to examine the area where the boat ramp was built for evidence of an Indian site. They found a remnant of a small site that was destroyed when the bridge was first built decades earlier before testing was required. And we've lost a lot of information that way. Again in Weyland, the water department contracted with John Milner Associates to conduct a survey of the water treatment plant, which is located on Route 27. It happens to be near the original town center of Sudbury Plantation that was here in the North Cemetery, where the first meeting house stood. Early 18th century artifacts were found along Baldwin's Pond, where the water department is located. And that can be explained by the presence of an early tavern on the vicinity, as well as possible other habitations. This was a very important site in Marlborough, the Flag Swamp Rock Shelter. It was discovered in 1980 during work done by another firm called Timelines. It was in the eastbound lane of Route 290. It was a very important site with good preservation of organic remains. After excavation, it was dynamited for the road and is totally gone. There's a free report available online if you go to MHC and Google Flag Swamp Rock Shelter. I worked in the Timelines lab on some of the samples when I was going to UMass Boston for my undergraduate degree. And this is really a fine rendition of what happened. Sometimes research takes a regional approach. SUASCO Survey of Resources in the Sudbury, Assabet, Concord watersheds. This information is given to every historical commission in towns within the Sudbury, Assabet, and Concord watershed. It was conducted in 2002 by Dr. Curtis Hoffman as a professor at Bridgewater State University. The Dory House at 107 Old Sudbury Road was an occupied house for 10 years and was in disrepair. It was purchased by the town after it was condemned. It's located near Baldwin Pond in the Sudbury River, where the Wayland Water Department and some town wells are located. The Historical Commission engaged UMass Amherst to examine the property before demolition. We had questions about how old this house really was. They brought students to dig with several local volunteers. The project was carried out from September to December of 2017. The earliest ceramic found near the back foundation dated to around 1820. There may have been an earlier house or a tavern on the property, however. And we think that's a possibility, but we didn't have any evidence of it. Draper's 1775 map showed a house occupied by Deacon Baldwin and located in the same place. The full report is on our Historical Commission page on the town website. Just look for the link to the Dory House report. It tells everything. There are photographs of some of the bones and shells and ceramics that came out of that excavation. In 2018, Wellesley College ran a field school to find evidence of student life around Wellesley College Hall, which burned down in March 1914. No one was hurt, luckily. One news story said that College Hall was Wellesley. The building itself was of immense size, as you can see in the picture. At 475 feet in length and rising 4 stories with five-story towers, it was one of the largest buildings in the United States at its opening, but it only took 4 hours to burn, according to the reports. Next slide. Notice we're talking about sites that are destroyed and not those that are still vulnerable to looting. The Massachusetts general laws pertaining to local historical commissions states that any information received by a local historical commission with respect to the location of sites and specimens as defined in section 26B of chapter 9 shall not be a public record. The location of archaeological sites known to the historical commission in each community is protected information. Where does pre-contact evidence come from? How do archaeologists find sites? People ask us this all the time. So, pre-contact evidence of Indian activity, where does it come from? Evidence collected by avocationals, also known as amateur archaeologists, early on before there were trained people, 19th and 20th century collectors, including Henry Thoreau, who found artifacts in plowed fields along rivers. He recorded them. Artifacts found after construction, road cuts, housing developments. An example is the Mansion Inn site in Weyland, which we will discuss in a few minutes. Excavations also conducted by Massachusetts Archaeological Society members in Sudbury uncovered sites there. One we will be talking about, the Concord shell heap where Emerson Hospital now is, and numerous other sites. Excavations conducted by professional archaeologists, which are called cultural resource management projects, do surveys before utility lines, highways, and bridges are built. There's a site, or was a site, called the Pine Hawk site in Acton, which was found by Public Archaeology Lab before a sewerage treatment plant was built. Mansion Inn. Many of you have probably heard about the Mansion Inn. I talked about this last year during Archaeology Month in honor of my professor at UMass Amherst. Mansion Inn is a famous site in Weyland, known to most New England archaeologists because of what was uncovered after a fire destroyed the mansion. It was destroyed in March of 1956. A cremation burial site was discovered by 3 avocational archaeologists when the site was cleared for construction by the developer. The town crier printed this story 3 years later in November of 1959. Dr. Fred Johnson from the R.S. Peabody Museum in Andover was called in to excavate. By the time the unlawful digging was stopped, an official excavation began, Not one burial feature was left intact. This would never happen today with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a federal NAGPRA law passed in 1990. Here are some artifact types found in the graves that were given local names: Wayland Notched Point and Mansion in Blades, to name two. Now, the large stone tool on the left is a modern replica of the classic Mansion in Blade made by Dr. Timothy Ives. He chipped it. He's an excellent flint knapper. The other tools pictured in the page on the right that the arrow points to are actually drawings. Let me see, I lost my place. Charred wood from the burials was carbon dated to around 3,400 years BP. And the large tool, as I just mentioned, is a replica. Published drawings and replicas do not offend Native people, as would photos or actual artifacts from the grave being shown to people. So now we'll talk about preservation and carbon-14 dating. New England has very acidic soils. That's why our rhododendrons and pine trees do well. Therefore, materials found in old sites generally are eaten away by the acidic soils, and so they're limited to stone tools, ceramics, burned bones, charred plant remains, and shellfish remains. If certain conditions are present, such as a shell heap or rock outcrops containing a high degree of calcium, submersion in water, or extremely dry conditions, then unburned materials, such as those found in the dry caves of the American Southwest, may be preserved. Only organic materials such as wood, nutshells, charred plant materials, shells, and calcined bone can be dated. Inorganic materials such as stone tools cannot be dated directly, only by organic materials closely associated with them in an archaeological site. As I mentioned earlier, charcoal from the burials was used to determine the age of the Mansion Inn site. Carbon-14 is absorbed from the atmosphere by all living beings, including humans, other living creatures, and all plants. When an organism dies, absorption ceases, after which the C14 decays at a constant rate, and the remaining amount can be measured in a laboratory to determine how long an organism lived. This dating method is only accurate up to 50,000 years. After that, you have to use another type of dating. These are typical ceramic sherds as they come from the ground. Their fragility at several centuries of plowing, along with social mechanics, have reduced them in size. Occasionally, larger fragments are found in relatively undisturbed sites, but this is mostly what we get around Weyland when we do find ceramics, and in most of the other sites in New England. You can see the scale on the bottom is a centimeter scale, which is 4/10 of an inch each bar. So these are not very big pieces. Next slide. This is a drawing of an atlatl. Atlatl is a Nahuatl or Aztecan word for this Native American throwing stick. There were no bows in New England until about 1,000 years ago, but research is still going on with regard to this question. The oldest existing bow from colonial New England is the Sudbury Bow, that's what it's called, dating from 1660, when it was taken by William Goodnow from an Indian who was ransacking his house. It is in the collections of the Peabody Museum of Harvard, and it's practically the only one that they have in their huge collection that is actually from New England. Here's how a hunter with an atlatl would have to stand to generate the greatest force. This local site, this is another site, was excavated in 2001 as a cultural resource management survey in Weyland. A stone feature dated to 1401 to 1495 AD. Now, this is a much more recent site. We recovered burned catfish bones, a charred huckleberry seed, and fragments of hazel and hickory nuts. At the bottom of the slide is a charred maize kernel. It says carbonized maize kernel. To my knowledge, this is the only maize kernel recovered in the Sudbury drainage. They're not very commonly found. This came from another excavation unit near the unit that had the feature in it. Remember the discussion about bows and arrows? This Levana Point is from the Harry Rice collection, which is housed in the Sudbury Historical Society. This point type is believed to be the true arrow point. It's called the Levana Point, and that's one of the more recent point types that we find. I'd like to focus on an interesting avocational dig led by a professional archaeologist named Dr. Hal Movius in mid-20th century in Concord. It was interrupted by World War II when the men went off to war, but it continued at a later time. The assemblage of artifacts was given to the Concord Museum, and it was never published until Dr. Shirley Blanca, who was curator of the museum, analyzed the results using original records. She asked me to analyze the bones. A complete article was published in the 2014 fall issue of the Bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. So here are some stone tools from the Middle Archaic levels on the left and the Late Archaic levels on the right. So it produced a fair number and range of types of stone tools. These are the best preserved bones from Davis Farm. Starting from the left, the gray bone is a turkey ulna. The second is a small fragment of a deer ulna. And look at the scale on the bottom. Those are centimeter scales again. It's from the front leg bone of the deer. The third is a sheep or goat humerus, and the fourth is a femur from a young pig. These came from a mixed upper level with both later and older soils. So it wasn't just a pre-colonial level. The pre-colonial level included calcined turtle bones. If you remember the discussion about preservation, I said that most charred and burned organic materials are what are mostly recovered from these levels. And that's quite a few, actually, to come from one level. And here's the table of charred nutshells. 23 small fragments of hickory and 1 hazelnut. These are typical recoveries. However, this work was done before an archaeobotanical flotation process was developed, so we're lucky these were recovered at all. Now we find nutshells that are very tiny. This is another recently discovered site. Oak Knoll site in Lincoln was discovered in 1999 near Crosby's Corner before reconstruction of routes 2 and 2A. Its importance lies in the fact that it's a single component site, meaning it was occupied by a single culture, the Orient phase of the early woodland around 3,000 years ago. So we are nearing the end of my talk, and so there should be plenty of time for questions. This is Weston's Golden Ball Tavern, which many of you may know. It was studied in 2 separate excavations, one by Public Archaeology Lab, and much later by the Boston University Center for Archaeological Studies. This photo dates from 1868. However, an inn was operated by Isaac Jones on the site from 1770 to 1793. This is partially reconstructed, but the excavations uncovered 18th century materials and foundations. So if you Google excavation at the Golden Ball Tavern, Boston University's newsletter from, I think it's 1984, will give you a more complete story of what they found. And this is what the Golden Ball Tavern looks like today. It's a National Historic Site. They do have open houses where I'm told that, I've never been there, not yet, when I'm told that artifacts are sometimes shown. So this is the end, and thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, you can send them to Courtney now.
Thank you so much, Tonya. That's fascinating. We have a few questions, and please feel free to keep adding to our list.
Okay.
So the first question I think is a bit of humor, but when you were describing the ice flows, this person said, Maine is freezing in the summer. Did they not know it was warmer further south? So maybe you can just talk a bit about patterns of where people settled over time.
Well, when the glacier was retreating, some sites have turned up at the southern boundaries, and the archaeologists who did those sites believe that people were living at the end of the ice sheet as it was retreating. In fact, I have seen photographs of modern glaciers where pine trees are growing on the top. And that seems to be a phenomenon that happens because the wind blows dirt up on top of the ice sheet, and the plants can get a start up there. And yes, they did know it was warmer further south. So they had to wait until the land opened up because the plants had to get started, which attracted the plant-eating animals like deer and rabbits and such. And then once the game was established and the berries were established and the nuts were established, the people came along with those other resources. They followed them. They came up from the south and probably from other directions as well.
Great. I'm going to stop my video because I'm not the star of this show and just be a voice in the darkness. So the next question is, where do the names of points come from? Like I think it was the Levana Point. Is it the location or the archaeologist?
That's a good question. I've never really looked into that. We have so few Levana points in Weyland that it's never come up. Mostly our sites are middle and late archaic. Woodland sites in New England are few and far between, and that is the truth. Now, with recent surveys, what is happening is that the cultural resource management firms that I'm a subcontractor for, I analyze the plant and animal remains. They are doing a lot of utility line work that stretch for miles. And there is one woodland period site that has turned up that I'm hearing about in New Hampshire with lots of large pieces of ceramics, and I don't know what all. So I think the more testing and work that's done, we'll find more woodland sites and Levana points. But until you have the evidence, it's really hard to say where these sites are. Many of them were late. They might have been located at the site of waterfalls, and that's exactly where the colonials came to build their mills. So sites have been obliterated by later development from colonial times. So we're really lucky that any sites are preserved, that we can find out more about how people lived. So I don't know if that answers the question about the Levana Point, but that one in the Sudbury Historical Society is one of the few that I've seen from around here.
So two folks have asked a question you were just talking about. What are their current studies going on? Are there any professional archaeology explorations being conducted in this area right now?
In this area, I do not always hear about them when they're actively working, unless people, if it's in Weyland, usually we hear about it. But if it's in other areas, because of the idea of trying to protect sites, they really don't talk about them that much. I tried to find from several historical commissions whether there were any past excavations. And Framingham, for example, they couldn't even tell me of any. They didn't seem to know anything about it. So unless you have an archaeologist on the historical commission who knows how to try to find out these things in their own town, then it's hard to find out. It really is. I mean, how many people have heard of the Wellesley College Hall fire? I just happened to be looking to see if there was any archaeology in Wellesley, which is more urban, and that popped up. And I thought that was really interesting to me. 1914, such a big building. The girls thought when the gong went off to get them out of the building that it was just another fire drill. They took their time getting their raft. This is what I was reading. And nobody was hurt, which was a good thing, but it totally burned. So I don't know what the class found, because that's not something that, unless somebody writes a paper about it that's published in a journal, would you find out about it necessarily, unless someone gives a talk about it.
So that's interesting. Actually, I never thought about keeping an excavation secret in order to protect it. Is that something that goes on? And then also, at one point you mentioned Native peoples taking offense at the exhibition of pictures or live artifacts, not live, but artifacts as opposed to drawings. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, to most of the Native American groups that I'm aware of, really, their ancestors are very, very important. And the burials are very, very important. And unfortunately, a lot of the early archaeology was carried out on excavating burials. I mean, look at Egypt. They concentrated on the pyramids, and only in recent years have archaeologists tried to find out where the common people lived and the people who built the pyramids, and they're finding sites not far from the pyramids that they're looking at now. But as far as Native Americans go, anything that is put in the burial is very, very sacred to them. In fact, one man who I really respected a great deal for his work. He was a very talented man, and unfortunately, he died too young, like about 40, from diabetes complications. But he would always say, if our ancestors threw it away and it's in the ground, leave it in the ground. That's what he told us one time. So it's a little hard because archaeologists do not want to offend people by doing things that would upset them, but there's no excavation of burials anymore unless it's endangered. Now, in Millbury, Massachusetts, which is out in central Mass around Worcester, there was a utility substation that was planned and was being built. And Public Archaeology Lab was hired to do the survey in that area. So they went out there, and as often happens, the last test pit of the day, the archaeologist in charge recognized that there was something that looked like terminal archaic and may have signaled a burial. So Native people were brought in. Usually when there is some kind of site like this, Native people do come, and they have a place in monitoring and watching, and they're often very interested in what turns up. So a full-blown excavation was planned because after meetings were held about, well, where else can we put this substation? And the Native people were involved in this. It was decided that there was no other place it could go. This had to be where it went. And so everybody, the archaeologists who worked on there, were smudged with, I'm trying to remember
Sage.
No, well,
Oh, sweetgrass.
they used other things here, but now they use sage for smudging. But it was sweet grass, I believe they might have used. But the archaeologist went through that ceremony before they started, and I'm trying to remember if they were smudged at the end of every day, because some groups feel that if you have been involved with remains of people, that there are spirits that might be disturbed. And one young man on that dig, I had heard the story, I have no idea if it's true, but he claims that one of the spirits followed him home and was doing strange things in the house. So, I mean, that's just a story. But that young man certainly believed something was going on. So that's where it comes from.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Mm.
So there's two questions that are kind of related. So the first is, are all recovered items from burials in Wayland? And then someone else is asking what type of shells were found in the inland shell heap. So I think that one answers the first question. It's not all burials in Wayland.
Okay.
What are the types of sites?
Okay, well, you know, the mention-in material from the burials that were excavated by the neighbors when it was first found out about, and a lot of looting went on. People didn't realize what they were doing. They just knew that there were some really neat Indian artifacts that were buried in these features. So they were digging them up. Many of them ended up in private collections. I saw one assemblage of artifacts that was for sale on, where is it, eBay, somewhere up in Maine. So these artifacts got carried away by private people early on. The Wayland Historical Commission, before my time, were given 3 different collections by local collectors who, I don't know they weren't very special artifacts, but they gave them to the previous coordinator of the archaeology group. And so my colleague on the historical commission, Amanda Chacho, and we realized that we had to meet the law, the NAGPRA law. So we managed to try very hard to return them to the Indians here. And it was a very, very frustrating process because I think they were having trouble trying to figure some things out, but they did say they would like to have them repatriated. So as it turned out, the Peabody Museum in Andover, the R.S. Peabody Museum, which is now called the Peabody Institute of Archaeology, they had a number of human remains in their collections. So they were repatriating a much larger collection than what we had. We just had 3 small boxes. So we inventoried everything and they agreed to take it and repatriate it with the larger lot that they have. So no, we do not, to my knowledge, have any collections left in Weyland, except the Historical Society does have some, and they were not interested in repatriating them.
So a follow-up on that question is, and did I mute myself? I can't remember. No, I didn't. Excuse me. Where can one see some artifacts in Weyland from Weyland?
Oh yes, we have a lot of artifacts from Weyland. The things that we have excavated, I didn't have time to go into some of the other local excavations because I wanted to give an overview of the Metrowest area. But the very first site that we excavated was called Castle Hill. If those of you who know where Alpine Road is, there's a soccer field there, quite a large area. And that was a known archaeological site by the local avocational archaeologists, one of whom took me under his wing when I was very first interested in archaeology. And so Bobby Robinson was also interested in Native American sites. So the 2 of us started seeing what we could do to do some archaeology there before the soccer field was built. And we did this as volunteers. We were not on the historical commission. We were just interested volunteers. But we went to the historical commission and they gave us their support. So we spent 2 days a week, I think, for 2 years excavating units there. Dr. Charles Nelson from UMass Boston, where I had just begun to study for my bachelor's degree in anthropology, he took out a permit for us and he gave us some very, very good early guidance. So he thought this was a wonderful opportunity for a community to learn about their pre-colonial past. And actually, in 1980, which was the second year that we had excavated, the Massachusetts Historical Commission gave our historical commission an award and said that we were a model for other towns because we were the first town that took an interest in that. So what happened is we ended up with a very small room in the town building, and that's our archaeology lab. And if anybody wants to see some of the things, they're more than welcome to make an appointment, but after the town building opens. And Amanda and I would be happy to show people some of what we have. Now, most of the things that come from excavations, you remember those little turtle pieces, those little tiny pieces. Well, little tiny pieces of calcined bone. Calcine means burned at a high temperature and turns it sometimes blue at about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And when it gets to be 650, it turns them white. So that's what we find, unless it's a shell heap, like I mentioned before. So there are little pieces of animal bones, there are little pieces of flakes, there are lots of charcoal. And it's not anything that people would get excited about, but that's what archaeologists study, and that's what tells us information. For example, one of the things I do is identify wood from archaeological site, pieces of wood charcoal. I've been asked to look at wood from historic period coffins in an African-American cemetery in New Hampshire to determine what kind of wood they were, the boxes they were buried in, so that they could be repatriated in boxes made out of the same wood. So that was an important thing for the Native community in New Hampshire. So we did that. So there's a lot of things, though, that we have in Weyland that would not excite anyone, as I said. But we do have some, and usually when I give it this talk or any talk, I bring an exhibit case of artifacts that start from the Middle Archaic down to the woodland, and I bring those along so people can see them, and they're all from Castle Hill. So maybe the next time I give a talk, I want people to bring that for people to see.
So
there was a question, Courtney, there was a question about what kind of shells.
Yes.
And what the Concord shell heap. Okay, that's a whole lecture all by itself. Now, the Concord shell heap was also excavated by amateurs. Emerson Hospital parking lot is mostly where that site was. And Henry David Thoreau, he collected there. Numerous people from the Peabody Museum at Harvard collected some things because I saw them in the collections. But the shell heap, now here's the thing about shells, which I didn't have time to go into. I did mention that shells have a lot of calcium. The calcium carbonate in the shells, when it's in a shell heap and it's there in the ground for millennia, decades, centuries, the rainwater will leach out the calcium and it goes into anything else that's in the heap of shells, like any bones, or not so much plant remains, but bones are very well preserved in that context. So context is everything for what you find. So the amateurs who excavated there, a lot of them kept what they found, but a man named Benjamin Smith from Concord, who was one of the first archaeologists in the Concord and Sudbury drainage as an amateur, but he was an excellent amateur archaeologist. So he tried to gather together everything that some people would give up, and he put them with his collection into the Concord Museum, the same place that the Davis Farm material in Sudbury ended up. And so I found out that there were a lot of turtles. The Massachusetts Historical Commission had sent a team around, and this is back in the early 80s. They sent a team to see what collections were in various places, just so they would know. And so the team that looked at the Concord Museum told me, well, there's a lot of turtles there, because I was interested in turtle remains at that time. So let me see. So I wrote a small grant proposal to get money to study that collection. And there were, Dr. Shirley Blanca was again involved in this. She studied the stone tools. I studied the bones. Someone else looked at the shells, and someone else, there was one piece of ceramic, that's all that was in that collection, just one piece. And so all of us volunteered our time, and we used the $1,200 that the IBM company gave us to radiocarbon date 2 bones. And we did them not with the regular dates, which are cheaper, but with accelerator dates, and that costs a lot more. So we got 2 bones dated, 1 turtle bone and 1 deer bone, that were very well preserved because of the shells. Now, to answer the shells, and I'll get back to this, the shells were river mussels, Elliptiocomplonatus. That was the genus and the species. So the Indians were collecting river mussels and eating them. And there was one quote by Thoreau, who tried eating one of them, a modern one. And he said they tasted like brown paper salted, which is kind of humorous. But it must have been a good resource for people who were living there at the time. So the 2 radiocarbon dates, first of all, the turtle bone was identified by a herpetologist connected to Harvard, and it turned out to be the Plymouth red-bellied turtle, which is endangered and was presently limited to ponds near Cape Cod. They didn't think they lived outside of that range. But here was one, there was 3 individuals that he found from the Concord shell heap of different ages. So we knew there were at least 3 turtles there, but he had a lot of fragments to look at. And so that was a paper right there, which is published in a place called Herpetological Review. I'm a co-author. It was just a very short paper about the occurrence of this species in the Sudbury drainage. Since then, Anders Rodin, Dr. Rodin, he studied some turtle remains from other sites, and he found that they ranged further away. So that was an important find because it was a range extension for the herpetologist who didn't know that that turtle had lived in other places besides those ponds by the Cape. So now there are a lot of there's a lot of work head-starting baby turtles from that species. Now the herpetologists have given them another designation. I think they call them the red-bellied scoter instead of the Plymouth red-bellied turtle. So that was a pretty significant site. And I do have a whole lecture just on that site.
I'm going to go back to what you were talking about before when you mentioned Castle Hill. A couple folks have, one person says, if I'm excavating to build a foundation for a new building in an area known to contain artifacts near Castle Hill, how can I find out what to look for? Is there any chance I might find something? And someone else is asking, what should we do if we think we found an artifact and want to see if it's anything important?
Well, a lot of people think they found artifacts, but when I look at them, they're just pieces of rock that look like they could be an artifact. And I know exactly why they picked it up and they thought that. Because there are more subtle things you have to know what to look for if you think you have an artifact. Anyone in the audience who thinks they have an artifact are more than welcome to, there's my email down at the bottom, tonya@largy.com, to send me an email, and we'll try to meet and we'll have a look at it, because that's something that you need to have a special eye and lots of training to recognize. Now, what was the other about the person building a foundation?
Yes.
In the area of Castle Hill.
Yeah,
Well,
should they expect to find anything? and how can they find out what to look for?
Well, it depends on whether it's a disturbed area already. Castle Hill was a very disturbed site. It had been planted in potatoes, and I understand the last crop was asparagus, which is planted very deeply in a soil. And then sometime in the 50s, there were some young men, one of them who grew up and told me about this. He said, we used to take our cars in the sand and ride around in the sand. And there were big ruts over there. So we had to be very careful where we put our test pits. And even then it was disturbed. However, we did find one feature that was a meter down. That's more than 3 feet down to the top of it. And that dated to 4,400 years ago. But it depends on where this building is going to go. It's something that I would do to come out and look at the spot and try to give them some advice if they want.
Okay. Another question about something in the area. Can you please talk about the Native American campsites on the shores of Lake Sudbury? Also, what were the boundaries roughly of Lake Sudbury?
That's a good question. In 1905, a geologist, I guess he was a geologist named Goldthwaite, connected to Harvard, wrote a publication about Glacial Lake Sudbury. And I have that, but I haven't looked at it for so many years. Now, I don't know that people have done a survey trying to see whether there are habitations along the ancient lake shoreline. I've never heard of anything like that happening. So since 1905, you'd think someone might have thought of it, but they haven't, and that sounds like a PhD doctoral dissertation project to me. So I can't really answer that question.
Okay. Let's see. Here's a question we probably should have started with. What were the main Indian tribes in the Wayland area, and did they get along with each other?
I don't know if they got along with each other, but the Massachusetts was one. The Wampanoags may have come up this far. It's really hard to know exactly which tribes were here because there was a lot of fluidity. People moved. I know that the Natick praying Indians, the woman who is their clan mother, told me that they were Massachusetts. So that much we're sure of. But Weyland is kind of a boundary between, I think let me try to remember that. I didn't anticipate this question.
I've seen a map with Nipmuc on it.
The Nipmucs are in central Massachusetts. They're out somewhere maybe west of, say, Natick, Sudbury, west of here. So they're in the interior. They were also called Nipnets in Hudson's History of Sudbury. But before the historic times, it's really hard to know what the groups were because they were still moving around quite a bit to follow the resources. And if they developed any territories, that happened sometime maybe in the late Archaic period. And that probably would have had to do with river basins. But none of them left their calling card.
A couple of questions about your field. So the first is, can you talk more about, this is something you mentioned early on, the botanical float test. How does
Oh,
that work? And then if you want to get more broad, someone is also asking, what made you decide to go into this field of research?
okay. Well, that goes back to 1980 when I was in my last year of anthropology studies at UMass Boston for my undergraduate degree in anthropology. My advisor wanted me to take a class at MIT in biological materials in prehistory because she had done a field school on Calf Island in Boston Harbor. And she had some good soil samples, and flotation was just becoming popular. A flotation is a water separation process. You can do it in a bucket, or you can have a great big machine that runs $500, and everybody does it in some way in between. There are more modest machines in archaeology labs too. But what it is you have water in a container and you have to introduce some air into it. Now, one lab that I visited, they had like a fish tank oxygen thing that would make the water bubble. And the water would rise up to a certain level. It would be agitated by the oxygen, the bubbles in the water. And then they would slowly pour in a bulk sample of the soil from a feature. A feature is a hearth, a fireplace, a storage pit, that kind of thing that's recognized during excavation. And then the water would separate the carbonized material, which are very light, sometimes very small flakes, pieces of chipping debris, tiny pieces of ceramic if they're not too heavy. And they separate things out and flow out into a set of geology sieves, which is a gradation of mesh spaces, so that 1 millimeter seeds are caught in one down at the bottom. Something that's like 3 to 5 millimeters will be caught in another screen. And that way, it's easier to see what was in the feature. So I took this class at MIT, which was a graduate level class, and it was very, very hard class. We had 4 professors. One was archaeobotany, one was zooarchaeology, and bones or shells or whatever kind of animal remains. The other was a professor at UMass Boston who was one of the earliest archaeobotanists. And the fourth one was a palynologist. He did pollen studies. So I had to do the archaeobotany class because my professor wanted me to do that. She wanted the data from it. So that's what I spent most of the class doing, but I was also interested in the bones. But we would have exercises on all of these things, and nobody could ever do all of the assigned exercises. It was a very difficult class, but I stuck it out, and that's where I got my beginning in this. Then the professor that was teaching about the bones, I ended up working for him in the Zooarchaeology Lab for many, many, many years and got a very good grounding. I ended up preparing skeletons, which I just stopped about a year and a half ago. I prepared 900 skeletons. I was building the reference collection for the Zooarchaeology Lab, which had just started around 1982 or so. So taking an animal apart and cleaning the bones and everything, that's a very good way to learn about their anatomy. So I developed a specialty in both bones and plants. But the archaeobotany is interesting. It's all microscopic work because the archaeologists who excavate it, they send me the dried results of this water flotation process. And so you have to look at it for hours under the microscope. And sometimes this is a lot of dirt and sand in there. So you're looking for a seed that's a burned seed yet, that's 1 millimeter in size. And you're trying to see it in the middle of all of this matrix that it's in. So you really need to have good visual memory for finding these things. Because some young people would say to me they wanted to learn how to do it. So I would set them up with a sample and featherlight forceps, because you can't crush the seeds because they're very fragile, or the nutshells. And after a while, they'd say, I just can't do this. I just can't do it. So there aren't too many of us that do it, but they're getting to be more. So a lot of the young people coming along are doing a good job.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions, if you don't mind.
No.
So one is about the climate here. So the question reads, does anyone know whether it was much colder in this area roughly 12,000 years ago, or was it just a few thousand years ago? Or is it thought that once the ice receded, there was a climate like we have today? I guess maybe an outline of the climate changes.
Well, that's a lot, but it was cold during the post-glacial times. It was cold, but there were people who were able to live there. I mean, like the people up in Alaska, they wore furs and they adapted to their environment. The Younger Dryas period, I should have reviewed that for this talk, but the Younger Dryas period was like another, after a period of warming, about 9,000 to 8,000 years ago. Then, no, I guess the Younger Dryas came in about 9,000 years ago, and it turned very cold again. So the plants reflected that. There are people that do deep cores in lakes, and then they look at what's down there in incremental areas along the core, and they can tell what the climate was like then. But I haven't reviewed that in such a long time, so I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to give much detailed information. Around 5,000 years ago, I do know, that's around the late Archaic period, there was a warming period. And that's when we find a lot in the botanical samples, a lot of hickory nuts. And the hickory trees that we have mostly now are not the prize hickory nuts that would have been sought by Native people. But if you're hungry, you learn how to process the bitter ones and eat them. So, but we know that this period was called the Hypsithermal about 5,000 years ago. And there was a spread in the population in this area. So a lot of our sites, I remember a professor saying 2 out of 3 sites in New England are from the late Archaic period. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah. The last question is sort of a little bit left field. Tell us about a mastodon tooth brought up by a fishing dragger on George's Bank.
I almost put the slide of a mastodon tooth in the program, but I thought I'd be putting too much in. I didn't know I would go through it so quickly. But when I was in the Zooarchaeology Lab, one summer, everybody else was somewhere else, and I was working in the lab. And I came into work, and somebody said, you know, we've got a shoebox here with something in it that some guy left, and would you be able to have a look at it? And I said, sure. So we took it up to the lab, and I opened it up, and immediately I knew it was a mastodon tooth. But that's about all I know about mastodons, because I don't work in paleontological times. I work in the Holocene where we know what the animals are. So I went over to the paleontology department and I said, look, I know this is a mastodon tooth, but I don't know anything else about it. So it turned out to be maybe 2/3 of a tooth. A piece had broken off, and he said it was a young mastodon. Now this had been brought up in a fisherman's net. This isn't the first one, and it wasn't the last one. They find all kinds of things down there, especially on George's Bank. And so it was starting to crumble because it had not, the saline had not been leached out. If it had been soaked in water, I think it would have preserved a little better, but it was starting to break up. But we did get a photograph of it. The graduate student took an interest in it because she was working on paleontological things. And so she took a wonderful slide of it, and I have the slide. And one of the pieces that crumbled off, they sent to have a radiocarbon date, and it came back 10,000 years old.
Wow.
So I tried to get the fisherman to donate it to the museum, but he wouldn't do it. He wanted to put it on his mantle. He was very proud of having found it. So I can't blame him there. Yeah. But I told him he better soak it in a bucket of water, and get that salt out, or he won't have anything left.
Huh.
So that's the story about the mastodon.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think that is the last of our questions for tonight, but I wanted to say thank you so much, Tonya. This has been fascinating, and we've had a lot of great questions from our audience.
Well, it's fun to, after the formal presentation, to hear the questions and try to remember the answers. There's an awful lot to know, and I've been around for a long time, and sometimes you start forgetting what you used to know.
Well, we learned a lot tonight. So I'll say thank you, and I'll say everyone can look for this presentation again on the library's YouTube or Waycam, and everyone have a great night. Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody.